8 years ago, I set out to learn something about the way seasoned English professors continue to reconceptualize and contemplate those courses that they teach year after year by spending a quarter as a participant observer in 5 different classes: poetry writing, film studies, children's literature, professional and tech writing, and 19th century literary empiricism. One of the questions I was wondering about at the time was whether teaching played a role in the development of these professors' professional and scholarly identities, and whether our pedagogical practices and approaches connected or divided us as a discipline. I was interested to see whether and to what degree these resident experts, to borrow a term from Rebecca Nowacek, and I'm just going to call her Rebecca because I always blow her last name, continue to grow their pedagogical expertise. In my current project, I approach these long-standing interests from a different angle by focusing on MA-level graduate students who are neither residents in their subject matter nor experts in teaching yet. Initially, I set out to examine how graduate students utilized and repurposed work from one context, teaching first-year writing, in another context, their graduate studies courses, and vice versa. I hypothesized that being a learner and a teacher at the same time would contribute to a heightened sense of meta-awareness in each discourse, especially when explicitly cued to look for connections. Although I suspected the first connections would be obvious and routinized applications, I hoped that eventually they would begin to articulate and differentiate the principles underlying each of these practices. I selected 6 MA-level graduate student teachers, 3 males and 3 females, ranging in ages from 23 to 37 when they entered the program in the fall of 2011. Originally, all identified as literary studies majors with a range of interests, but one subsequently switched to creative nonfiction. All were interested in learning more about teaching and becoming co-inquirers with me in this project. At the end of each quarter, I conducted hour-long semi-structured interviews with each graduate student. In addition, I collected all their syllabi and graduate seminar papers. They would also self-report things, their observations to me from time to time. This past winter, we co-wrote and presented a paper for 4Cs in conjunction with Carmen's research, building on Joseph Harris's well-known observation about composition as a teaching subject. We explored how a first-year writing program and the graduate students who teach in it might serve a larger and more visible mission within the university, one that could uncover tacit assumptions and help integrate and align writing expectations. Our first-year program is unusual for a couple of reasons, and I have a handout somewhere, so see if you can find a folder. The course is taught almost exclusively by graduate students. While most schools require TAs to have 18 hours of graduate level coursework prior to teaching, our teachers began teaching their first quarter. I should also note that our first-year writing course, teachers are learning to teach many of the same intellectual moves and inculcate the same kinds of rhetorical awareness I was looking for in our conversations. In my own experience, the proximity of activities to each other contributes and cues connection making. I also thought that teaching might act like a meta-language and allow these graduate students to articulate for themselves what they were doing in their own reading and writing. Would the heightened sense of meta-awareness that comes from teaching while learning loop back into the graduate studies courses? And would they be able to recognize it when it did? I don't know. Maybe, perhaps. It depends. As is often the case with interesting problems, things get messy. There we go. Okay, based on preliminary findings, I began to chart things in a Venn diagram. Space 1 represents knowledge and practice associated with teaching first-year writing. Space 2, the reading and writing students do in their graduate studies. Individuals who occupy these 2 spaces can perform the work of each discourse, but see them as separate domains. 3 represents general dispositions and habits of mind. Dispositions are predilections to think and act in certain ways, personal qualities and general abilities rather than expertise in a specific domain. I think there's a lot more work needed in identifying particular dispositions, but we do know these are important. Space 4 represents reflectiveness applied to teaching, and 5 represents reflectiveness applied to graduate coursework. Individuals who occupy 4 and 5 demonstrate meta-awareness within each domain. In other words, they can not only perform the work of the domain, when cued, they can talk about what, how, and why they are doing it. 6 represents low-road connections and applications between discourses. These involve seeing connections between similar practices. I think we, or at least I, may have been a little quick in dismissing the important role this kind of connection making plays, which often results in aha moments for students. Noticing similarity between domains is a necessary step. It's just not a sufficient one for what Rebecca calls integration, all right, and Elizabeth, I won't call you Wardle either, calls repurposing for expansive learning. So here, Amy demonstrates this kind of connection making when she recognizes how the work she's been asked to do in her graduate seminar is very similar to a move she is trying to teach her own students. Teaching makes me hyper-aware in mostly positive ways. I'm finding tie-ins between what I'm teaching my students and what I'm doing at the exact same time. My students were doing the they say, I say practice, and I had just written my prospectus for 20th century global literature, and it's exactly the same. Here's what's been said before. Here's what I'm adding to the conversation. Here's what's important to me. Here's where I hope to take this whole project. So I pull it up for my students. Here are quotes setting up the conversation. Here is where I want to extend on what they said. This project is important. It adds to the field in this way. Look, I'm still doing this 6 years after you're starting to do it. You're going to have to show wherever you go that you know what's been done and that you got something to add to it. Space 7, the middle space, represents the space where integrative learning and interdisciplinary understanding between first-year writing and graduate studies courses occur. Individuals who occupy this space are able to perceive and articulate connections between different domains. I didn't see a lot of these, but a couple. In this excerpt, Sam is beginning to articulate the underlying principle that links Bourdieu's ideas about how people construct concepts of taste in the negative with Reif and Bowarsky's concept of not genre. Bourdieu has this social critique and construction of taste. It's something the professor teaches in trash cinema. We look at trash aesthetic and trash taste. One of the things that Bourdieu said that really stuck with me is the idea that people construct their taste in the negative, where we know what we don't like. I see this as having parallels with the idea of not genres, where it's constructing in the negative, but not in the pejorative sense. I agree that thinking in the negative can be more beneficial than not. That is to say, by touching on a previous genre, like the 5-paragraph essay, and talking about what students are doing now as not being that, we can maintain this sort of attachment to it, so it's not like we're asking our students to just throw it in the waste bin and get rid of it. What I like about this diagram is its flexibility and the fact that it brings dispositions to the fore. So here's the first ball I want to throw out today. I think this mapping could be useful for thinking about how and to what extent individuals perceive connections between all sorts of domains, between concepts, texts, discourses, cultures, experiences, as well as the role various dispositions play in these processes. So I'm still working through piles of data, and I want to talk this morning a little bit more conceptually and suggestively about a couple of pieces that might fit into the transfer puzzle before we move on to hear what Carmen has to say. After she speaks, I'll come back with a few more thoughts about why graduate teachers may be prepared to contribute to conversations about teaching and writing in the university. In her book, Agents of Integration, Rebecca uses the term genre discursive space to refer to the entire constellation of associated relations within which individuals operate and make meaning. The constellation of both tacit and explicit associations includes knowledge, ways of knowing, identities, and goals. The first-year writing program and the graduate students who teach in it comprise the most pliable genre discursive space in our university. And so, did you find the handouts?
Yes.
Yeah, so just pass them out. There's a handout just with some information about our first-year writing program, because I think the site is interesting for studying these questions. It's not that important, though, so Our program functions as a kind of way station where everyone, except for the single resident WPA, passes through en route to somewhere else. As I mentioned, the course is taught almost exclusively by MA-level grad students who've come to study literature, creative writing, and occasionally teaching. Half the teaching staff is new every single year. However, the constant movement of new students and new teacher learners through this space, where the flow of knowledge, ways of knowing, identities, and goals are always in flux, gives rise to a culture where both individual understanding and programmatic approaches to writing, learning, and teaching can be continually examined, repurposed, and redesigned. The first-year curriculum itself is an always evolving, homegrown hybrid consisting of all sorts of fancy mutt genres and approaches that I devise in order to help students and teachers learn to make and convey connections and learn to teach certain rhetorical moves. Rebecca claims that genres are not just a resource for crafting a response to a social situation. Genres also provide a resource for interpreting and indeed constructing that situation in the first place. Thus, the genres we utilize in first-year writing not only have implications for students, they also have an important role to play for new teachers. So here's my second bowl, and it's a bit of a mouthful. If genres play a role in determining what kinds of connections are appropriate, invited, or even possible, and if genres that are not strongly linked with disciplinarity offer a more pliable genre discursive space for transformative and integrative learning, since they are less saturated with prior associations, might working with certain kinds of open-ended mutt genres also provide the exigence for these forms of learning, not only for undergraduate students, but also their graduate student teachers. One such mutt genre is what I call the inductive inquiry essay. The essay begins with a critical inquiry question or thinking problem that emerges from the writer's examination of the particulars in the text that they are working with. The aim is to arrive at a new insight or understanding, something the writer couldn't have said when they began writing. The essayistic structure often mirrors the writer's thinking practice and follows a kind of loose meandering path of question, hypothesis, question. The language of the essay is tentative. Perhaps, maybe, I wonder, could it be? For Justin, who entered the program after a successful 10-year career as a prosecuting attorney, no genre could have been as antithetical to his experience. Everything stood in direct conflict with his prior legal writing, where he had to frame arguments, find evidence, and anticipate objections ahead of time. In this excerpt from his fourth quarter interview, Justin explains how he finally began to grasp this genre while he was writing a seminar paper on the God of small things. Okay, so here's Justin. The voices of the characters in that novel that would be considered subaltern are so strong and so compelling. Why are these voices so memorable, and what made them that way? A lot of it seemed to come back to inventing new forms of language and hybrid forms of language. And where I ended up in that paper was how this linguistic hybridity mirrored the cultural hybridity, and how ultimately that could provide brand new epistemologies of knowledge, ways of thinking and speaking and communicating and challenging the dominant discourse. It took a long time to get there. And every time I wrote about it, it raised more questions, which ended up bringing in more theory that I didn't fully understand, which in turn raised more questions. DQQs. See, you're doing QHQ. Yeah, it really followed QHQ. I'm going to do more of that this quarter before I teach the inductive essay. So if what I'm calling open-ended mutt genres can provide the exigence for connection making for both students and teachers, then how might our understanding of the purpose of first-year writing change? Based on my local context, I've been thinking about how the first-year writing course acts as a way station and exchange portal for both students and teachers. But rather than being a portal into disciplinary writing and thinking, perhaps first-year writing could set in motion a connection-making capacity for what Veronica Boix-Mansella calls interdisciplinary understanding. Okay, in her words, interdisciplinary understanding is the capacity to integrate knowledge and modes of thinking drawn from two or more disciplines to produce a cognitive advancement. For example, explaining a phenomenon, solving a problem, creating a product, raising a new question in ways that would have been unlikely through a single disciplinary means. And here's my last ball before I turn things over to Carmen. While our first-year course is not exactly interdisciplinary, certainly not like the classes Rebecca talks about in her work, the focus of the course is on learning to make connections between ideas and concepts from different texts and utilizing rhetorical moves in order to say something or do something that would not have been possible otherwise. The principle I take from Boix-Mansella, then, is both a habit of mind and an approach for doing intellectual work. It's really no surprise to me that I find this a promising direction. The only surprise is that it took me so many years to articulate the idea. I have an interdisciplinary degree myself, and I've always roamed through many fields in search of concepts and approaches that might help me explain and articulate ideas and produce my own cognitive advancements. I try to cultivate this interdisciplinary foraging and borrowing in my TAs because I believe these approaches engender the predilection and wherewithal to think with concepts and use and apply them flexibly in their own teaching. So I'm just going to get Carmen set up here.
And I'm just going to start talking. Okay. So like Donna, I have led a wandering life as an academic. Let's just say I've taught around. And some might even, it's true. Some might even call it pedagogical promiscuity. I began by teaching high school English, accidentally taught grade school after I had an engaging conversation with the principal of a private elementary school who needed a third grade teacher for a year. And they asked me to stay and then teach sixth grade and 2 years of kindergarten. From there, I moved from teaching kindergartners in the spring to teaching first-year comp in the fall as an MA grad student. Then I ended up stepping in as the first-year writing assistant director to no director 1 year, and then directed our writing center for several years, in addition to teaching writing courses from first year through graduate school. But for the last nearly 20 years now, I've been in an administrative position, though I continue to teach one writing course each year. So I'm working in cross-disciplinary contexts as the director of our writing instruction support program, and I work with the upper division writing requirement, mostly in a professional development role for faculty teaching our upper level writing proficiency courses, which some of you know as writing intensive courses. I also work in directing a teaching learning academy, which is a fairly distinctive campus-wide forum on teaching and learning that includes faculty, staff, community members, and students who talk about teaching and learning and try to enhance our learning culture. The third part of my job is directing our library's new learning commons. And up until the close of this last term, I've also co-chaired our Gen Ed committee, and we're about to embark on a possible revision of our Gen Ed breadth requirement. I'm telling you about my checkered past and also my administrative position because I hope it will help you understand what I want to highlight today in our session, namely the importance of situating research on writing in the context of teaching and learning writ large. I would also like you to consider not only the what of my study, but the so what and the now what and the what if, a vision of the possible, and invite you to think about how we might build relationships across our institutions and with our students. So here's what I did for my study. I was really interested in a fairly simple question. I wanted to hear what various stakeholders across our university talked about when they talked about their expectations for academic writers. Like other WPAs, I have speculated on what my colleagues in multiple contexts at my institution expect writers to know, do, and believe. but I didn't have any data to support my speculations. I assumed there would be gaps in our expectations, misalignments that might point to affordances that could help our student writers move more smoothly from first-year writing to upper division writing. Students in my study came from our one required first-year comp course, which Donna has told you about, and from our upper division writing proficiency courses. Faculty included the first-year instructors, who, as Donna has noted, are almost exclusively graduate TAs, and as well as a sampling of WP course faculty from across the disciplines. The central administrators that I surveyed included people like the provost, deans, and directors, as well as the chairs of some large departments. My own expectation was that I would hear first-year students and faculty report expectations that were different from the upper division students and faculty, but I wondered how. I also assumed that central administrators would have yet different expectations, but again, curious to how they would be different. I confess that I did entertain a fantasy that there would be many areas, or at least some areas, of overlap, some common verbiage in how the various stakeholders talked about their expectations for writing. Ultimately, I was surprised by the disparity between what students and faculty privileged at various levels, and frankly stunned to see how much their expectations differed from central administrators, the ones with authority over our institutional resources. So, this is the method then. In order to get a macro sense of what these various stakeholders would say about their expectations, I surveyed students pre and post in all the first-year comp sections, fall of 2011, winter and spring of 2012, as well as the graduate instructors who teach those courses in the fall of 2011 and spring of 2012. And then I conducted 3 mixed focus groups in the winter of 2012 that were facilitated by a trained program assistant. And I did one interview with an upper division faculty this past quarter. I really wanted to do more, but I just ran out of time, so I hope to continue that. Over the course of my study, I also engaged 8 undergraduate students who helped compose the survey questions and the focus group questions, and they also helped me generate the coding categories, and we talked about analyzing the emergent data as well. I can't deal with pen technology. So again, this is just part of the sampling here. So thanks to Donna's help, I was able to survey all of the first-year comp courses for a full academic year. So I ended up with an N of approximately 2,500 students. And then the responses from 50 of the graduate TA instructors. My survey invitation to upper division students and faculty yielded a much smaller number, but did provide a random sampling from across our 7 colleges, with a final N of 52 writing proficiency faculty and 126 writing proficiency students. I surveyed the administrators only once. Actually, the results were so painful that was plenty. Resulting in an N of 27. Grounded theory approach emerged 16 coding categories, which I'll show you in a minute. And again, I just want to keep noting that there were some undergraduates involved in this. They helped me not only with the survey construction, but they also helped me develop these 16 categories. The first 8 were these. Now, those are the overall categories, but there were variations on how those were expressed. The second 8. I do want to highlight number 14, which was a surprise to me, and I want to talk a little more about that in terms of first-year students' responses. Metacognition, too, the last one. So I'm not going to get into the details of all the results for our purposes today, but I do want to highlight the categories that each of these sets of stakeholders privileged, in other ones, the ones that had the highest percentage of response. The great majority of first-year faculty and students spoke to the expectation of critical reading and analysis. So there was a real alignment there, both in pre-surveys, but it held steady in the post-surveys. That was an important expectation for those students and those faculty at the first year. An interesting difference is that first-year faculty also tended to emphasize thesis and claim from the very beginning and throughout the term, while in pre-surveys, first-year students emphasized expectations around classroom behavior. It reminded me of the connection between working with kindergartners and first-year students. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, that they're getting used to being college students. That was high on their expectation. This concern with simply being a good student shifted to the importance of being able to cite or perhaps document or perhaps incorporate evidence. Not entirely sure by the end of the term, but they often referenced a specific strategy that is used in our first-year comp class as something all writers should be able to do. The citation sandwich came up over and over again. Here are some examples of the words and phrases that the first-year faculty, the TAs, used to talk about their privileged expectations. Some of the language that they used. And the students often spoke in similar terms. Come to terms came up a lot. The bottom one suggests the kind of response around classroom behavior. I need to be on time. I better be prepared. I need to submit things on time. I need to come to class. And maybe they're right. I mean, maybe that is one of the main expectations for academic writing, is to sit in your seat and get the sucker done. So it has to do with behavior. I don't know. In contrast to first-year faculty, writing proficiency faculty, so this is a cross-disciplinary context, overwhelmingly privileged organization, coherence, and form, as well as evidence and development above all other categories in their survey responses. Instead, the students in those writing proficiency courses tended to talk more about issues of expression, so more at the sentence level actually, around clarity and concision, as well as the need to know conventions, mainly of documentation. Please note, there was not one response that spoke to the role of critical reading. I think that's an important misalignment to know.
Across both?
Pardon me?
From both faculty and students?
Correct. So that's a real difference there. Now that doesn't mean, however, that they don't expect it, but they didn't talk about it. Here are the kinds of things faculty said. I mean, this is a particular example from anthropology. How to write a scholarly paper in a general social science style and then follow specific conventions applying to archaeology. Organize, conduct research, incorporate opinions. Here are the kinds of things that some of the students said.
Whiz-bang with APA.
Yeah. While there may have been some variation in what faculty and students privileged, and there was absolutely no doubt about what administrators that I surveyed expected. 24 of the 27 administrators talked almost exclusively of surface level conventions. And I remember Donna saying, "Are you sure that that's what they meant?" And there's absolutely no doubt in their comments. And often the only response was about grammar and punctuation and even spelling. So there's really no doubt there about what they were emphasizing. Now, I'm an administrator, so.
They've been teachers, some of them.
Yeah, but how quickly we forget. Actually, a number of them reported having taught writing. So that's even more concern. Okay, so what was missing from the expectations across levels, and I think this should be of high concern, it is to us, there wasn't really anything in any of the responses about metacognition I think it was maybe 3, they were all from students. And here's what one first-year student said: I think I'll need to be able to explain what's going on in my head when I do a writing assignment. I think an important omission. So I've spent most of my time highlighting the survey responses because they're telling in what these various stakeholders made explicit about their expectations in limited sound bites without any prompting. So this is just what came to the surface. But in an extended context, like the focus groups and the interviews and in informal conversations, what these stakeholders said about their real, generally more tacit expectations is very different. Here's an example of what one writing proficiency faculty said in an interview about her main expectation that student writers have what she termed basic skills. And this is a person who teaches a writing proficiency course every quarter, every year. You would think, the tone here is disturbing, of course, but you would think that by the time they are seniors, they would have basic skills, like the idea that you need a topic sentence, that the rest of the paragraph relates to the topic sentence, good sentence structure, a sense of audience, how to make an argument. You know, basic skills. I think we probably would have inverted that order, right? Started the other way. The surprising interpretation of basic skills by this faculty member then draws into question, at least for me, all the survey responses. What did the various stakeholders mean when they used these terms? When students say they expect to be able to use a citation sandwich, do they mean they need to know how to incorporate evidence or to use APA appropriately? I suggest that we need to pay attention to both the immediate responses that writing faculty give, as they likely reflect the language that they're using on a syllabus, as well as the more fully explicated language that they might use in an extended conversation. Given these misalignments, not only between what stakeholders expect across various levels, but also the gaps between what stakeholders say their expectations are and what they actually mean, it's a wonder students can navigate the white waters of academic writing at all. It's a wonder they stay afloat. I'm going to turn it back to Donna now to interrogate what these misalignments might mean in terms of expertise about writing.
So I want to share some of my most recent interdisciplinary meanderings that I think have implications for Carmen's findings and for our discussions at this conference. In their book, Rethinking Expertise, sociologists Terry Collins and Robert Evans have developed a table of expertise that I found helpful for describing why my shifting collection of non-resident teacher learners may have something to offer the disciplinary resident experts of the university. Collins and Evans distinguish between what they call ubiquitous and specialist expertise. Ubiquitous expertise describes the abilities and skills all people acquire as they learn to negotiate through life and live in human society, the beginning from which all other expertise is built. This acquired expertise produces a huge amount of tacit knowledge, things we all know how to do without being able to explain how we know how to do them. Specialist expertise is expertise in a specific domain and includes both general and specific kinds of tacit knowledge. The tacit knowledge that we acquire through ubiquitous life experiences is often exercised in the course of acquiring more explicit knowledge through reading and listening. However, Collins and Evans contend that the development of this more specialized expertise requires enculturation and ongoing conversation in and with the Society of the Domain Experts. They describe 3 kinds of ubiquitous tacit knowledge, moving from general to specific. At our university, the administrators and many of the faculty who teach the upper division disciplinary writing courses have mostly acquired this kind of tacit knowledge in the teaching of writing. They are immersed in the subject matter of their disciplines, but not so much in writing instruction. While they have more than what Collins and Evans call beer mat knowledge, which is the kind of fact-like knowledge you need to sort of pass knowledge quizzes, much of their knowledge is really, I think, in the popular understanding category of writing instruction. This, of course, hides detail and nuance, and popular understanding is particularly questionable in places where matters are complicated or not settled, such as writing instruction. Primary source knowledge comes from reading and listening. It's necessary but not sufficient for more specialist expertise. The popular understanding of my graduate students is gradually complicated as they gain knowledge of composition and rhetoric and pedagogy from their reading in their seminars. However, because they are constantly immersed in the domain of writing instruction, through their coursework, their teaching, ongoing conversations with and about writing other experts in the domain, they begin to accumulate more specialist forms of teaching expertise. Some of the disciplinary faculty do attend the professional development opportunities that Carmen makes available and gain small amounts of primary source knowledge through articles on best practices and the like. But for the most part, they do not stay immersed in these conversations about writing and the teaching of writing for extended periods of time. You know, just as we know that first-year writing, some people think it's the inoculation, you know, you get it and you're good to go. Well, often these professional development workshops, I think, work in a similar way. Okay, I got it, but end of conversation. So they rarely have the opportunity to develop more specialized kinds of opportunities. What's really interesting to me about Collins and Evans' work is they divide specialist expert knowledge into two categories. Now, contributory expertise is the way that we think of all experts. They've acquired knowledge and skill, and they can do things with their expertise. They contribute to furthering the knowledge in their domain. But I find their other category, interactional expertise, particularly rich for my thinking about teaching and learning in this project. I believe this concept of instructional expertise can shed light on why non-resident graduate student teachers who do not plan on becoming contributory experts in the field of writing studies can sometimes be as successful, and maybe in some cases more so, than the resident experts in the discipline. Interactional experts become fluent in the language of the domain through a process of enculturation and ongoing conversation. Over time, they can talk about specialist forms of knowledge with others, both within and outside the domain, even if they do not actually contribute to the field themselves. While contributory expertise can be kind of self-sustaining, interactional expertise is not, and I think this is really important. If my TAs do not stay in conversation with other experts in the field once they graduate, their knowledge, their expertise will become archaic, and we see evidence of that all around us. Textbooks, number one, syllabi, assignments, except for some, of course, assignments and pedagogies. Interactional expertise is the expertise of ethnographers, art and literary critics, reviewers, science writers, managers, peer reviewers, coaches, and I would suggest many writing teachers. It can also serve as a bridge between ubiquitous and other specialist knowledge, a factor that has implications for the graduate students in this study. Now, I've purposely upended the triangle here because I want to suggest that developing greater levels of specialist expertise is a matter of immersing in the domain more deeply over time. It's not a matter of going higher, it's going deeper. So let me throw out another ball here. If individuals are merely carrying and integrating ubiquitous tacit knowledge from course to course, just very general understanding, can there be any real expansive learning? Might the kinds of transfer we are most interested in involve converting this ubiquitous knowledge into more specialized forms of knowledge? And so it's a question that I'm just thinking about at the moment. Now, while we might expect contributory experts to also demonstrate interactional expertise, we've all found experts who don't. Collins and Evans would say their interactional expertise is latent. And by latent, they mean these experts don't need more knowledge in their field. Instead, they may lack certain dispositions, such as interactive and reflective abilities, that are needed to turn this latent expertise into more expressed expertise. I might also suggest that pedagogical and rhetorical knowledge and abilities play a role in sort of turning this latent knowledge, interactional knowledge, into more specialized forms. So let me just summarize about interactional expertise. Because they are fluent in the language of the domain, their expertise can be indistinguishable from contributory experts in many cases. In some fields, the interactional experts are the contributory experts, such as the art critics and the wine connoisseurs. Certain dispositions or pedagogies may be needed to turn latent expertise into expressed interactional expertise. And interactional expertise is probably the medium of exchange in interdisciplinary contexts and between experts and the public. Furthermore, interactional expertise is the expertise of teachers who are immersed in conversations about their subjects and their teaching. Most graduate student teachers develop various degrees of this kind of expertise during their time in the program. Because graduate student teachers are in constant conversation with others and their development continues over the whole 2 years they're with us, they have an opportunity to constantly replenish, expand, and deepen this expertise. And I want to add one last piece here, and that's the idea of meta-expertise or judgment that we use to evaluate expertise. I suspect that almost any kind of writing course seeks not only to develop students' expertise in writing, but also their ability to read and make judgments about what makes a piece of writing, both their own and others, effective in a specific context. Collins and Evans distinguish between two kinds, external and internal, and both are at work in my program. In one, the external, individuals make judgments about expertise, but they don't have that expertise themselves. We do that all the time. I'm very good at sort of judging other people's expertise, that I don't know what I'm talking about. But in the other, they at least have an acquaintance or interactional expertise with the subject they are evaluating. On the other hand, interactional experts such as literary critics, reviewers, and connoisseurs have specific knowledge of the subject and experience that they are judging. They know the conventions of the field or domain. So in other words, art critics may not do art, but they know art, and that's what makes them an interactional expertise. So the development of meta-expertise, I think, is an indication of interactional expertise. Most TAs enter the program with ubiquitous kinds of discrimination and their abilities to make judgments about writing and teaching. We spend a lot of time reading student papers so they can hone these judgments. Through their ongoing enculturation, they learn to make finer and finer distinctions based on local conventions and practices in our program. Some TAs, by virtue of their continued reading, begin to situate our local programmatic practices within the wider field. They begin to use that knowledge to expand their individual understanding. They begin to experiment with it, and then that feeds back in and influences and changes our program over time. That's why it's always evolving. The other kind of expertise that they talk about is referred expertise. And I suspect this relies in part on the ability to recognize similarities and differences between the genres operating in the current domain and the genres operating in prior domains in which you have some expertise. These connections are not always apparent to my graduate student teachers, which again continues to surprise me. My students have to be cued to notice them. For example, in this excerpt from our interview at the end of his first quarter of teaching, Justin, our ex-prosecuting attorney, discusses how he taught audience awareness to his students and thought about audience in terms of his own writing. In my 101 class, we talked about thinking of your reader as lazy, stupid, mean, and ignorant. Not a very flattering way to think about your reader, but helpful for spelling everything out and not making assumptions for what someone might know. So I reminded myself about that when I was writing. I would regularly ask myself, how would somebody counter this? What would somebody say in response to this? Then I'd briefly raise it in my writing and try to address it right there. Kind of preemptive counters. How Justin conceptualizes audience to himself and his students seemed to me like an obvious and direct connection to his expertise as a lawyer. But he only recognizes this connection when I ask him about it during an interview. At this stage, he has the expertise, but he doesn't recognize it. And unless he recognizes it, he can't refer to it. It can't be referred expertise. And so after I asked him about a possible connection, he says, oh, yeah, I suppose a lot of it did come from my trial experience, but it took me a long time to make the connection and see that the same technique could be effective in writing. It wasn't until Justin's 5th quarter, however, that he explicitly drew on this expertise to help him teach students how to make their arguments stronger by anticipating objections. He showed them an actual PowerPoint that he had used as an attorney to counter the defense's arguments. And he spelled out everything he thought the defense would say, and then the next slide would show how he countered it. So although he made the connection back in 1st quarter, he didn't use it until his 5th quarter. So this referred expertise didn't come in. Because of the ongoing enculturation and conversation in the first-year writing program, many of my TAs begin to develop this interactional and meta-expertise with respect to teaching first-year writing. And I think where I see the most growth is in that space 4, that connection between first-year writing and dispositions. And I think the meta matters are most visible there because meta matters there. Okay, there's my clever one. Okay. So to close, let me return to Justin, the lawyer. When he begins teaching, he saw his dual positioning as a graduate student and graduate student teacher as negative in terms of his lack of expertise and authority. In law, he had always been trained to know the right answer. In this excerpt, we had been talking about James Paul G's concept of mush faking, which means to creatively make do with whatever materials are available. Justin couldn't grasp the creative part. He just kept concentrating on the faking part. And he says this, mush faking is terrifying because there's this fear of getting called out and getting caught faking. And that might get you in that might come from law because pretending to know something more fully than you did would get you in a heap of trouble. There was this one experience I had when I was just starting out as a lawyer that really made an impact on me. It was probably my 2nd week working as a temporary attorney at my first job. And somebody asked me to take this court document to the judge, find him in his chambers, get his signature. That's all they told me. And so I take it to this judge, and he's this old, crusty, stern guy, a year or so away from retirement. He's been a judge for 25 years. And I take him the document, and I ask for his signature. And he starts asking me all sorts of questions about it. What is this? What's it for? And I'm just stammering. I don't have the answers. And he looks at me with piercing glare and says, always know the answer when a judge asks you the question. The right answer was just of paramount importance in the law. You had to have the right answer or a very compelling argument that could be portrayed as the right answer, even if there's debate about what the right answer is. However, after writing his graduate paper on hybridity, he begins to construct a new connection between the creative possibilities hybridity engenders in subaltern characters and his own hybrid teacher-student position. In these 3 excerpts from our 4Cs presentation, Justin begins to suggest how the interactional expertise, meta-awareness, and hybridity that comes from being both teacher and student at the same time can be a very useful thing. So I'm going to read you 3 excerpts. We shift from learning to teaching on a constant and frequent basis. Our hybrid identity also allows us to shift into student mode while technically acting as the teacher. Consequently, we can speak to our students as peers and have conversations about teaching and learning through transparent dialogue. Our hybrid status, complemented by this transparent dialogue, may offer a unique level of access and insight to student thinking, including what works and what doesn't work. By not trying to position ourselves as resident experts, we may open lines of communication that allow for integration between students and faculty and across disciplinary lines. While lacking the permanence of resident experts, our transitory interactional expertise, derived from simultaneously learning and acquisition, offers a model for both students and faculty to think of themselves as evolving and dynamic learners. The thinking and adapting on a constant basis guards against privileging a static or monolithic knowledge that is sometimes associated with resident expertise. And lastly, if other university stakeholders had a clearer understanding of our goals and practices, they might be better positioned to extend our work within their own respective disciplines. This outreach on our part could enable additional boundary crossing and remind all stakeholders that we share the same fundamental goals and that in spite of specialization, we're on the same team. Okay, so to my team member.
So what? So what? And now what? And then we do, I think, still have some time for some what ifs. So how do we take advantage of this interactional expertise that Donna has suggested that first year faculty bring in addressing the kinds of misalignments that my study revealed? I'm curious, how many of you teach first year comp? Oh, wow, okay. I'm going to suggest, and Donna and I haven't talked about this, but I think that there's a lot more of that conversation and ongoing dialogue, whether it's a cohort of graduate TAs in first year comp, certainly than it is anywhere else. So I think you bring that same kind of interactional expertise. So just a reminder, those are the kinds of misalignments all across the levels, along with the fact that our real expectations are often tacit or disguised by other terms. So what do we need? These are 4 possibilities. A shared lexicon or glossary would be helpful. Not only do we need some kind of common vocabulary to talk about writing across levels, we need some sense of how to gloss the terms and conceptualize them similarly while allowing for disciplinary differences and adaptations. I went to a session yesterday that some folks from Eastern Carolina did, and that was one of the main things they said was we need a shared language. We talk in different languages, multiple dialects. It seems like a simple thing, but again, students need it. We could usefully, I think, turn to the vocabulary that's used in our first year comp program as a start. For example, first year instructors, like our writing center assistants and maybe yours, make a distinction between global concerns, such as claim, reasoning, and organization, and local concerns. That's helpful language. Students say this distinction is very helpful to them because it reminds them, for example, to revise globally first before editing locally. So why not offer this kind of vocabulary that's often used in the first year comp class to writing proficiency faculty, since their students will have heard it before. One discipline-based faculty at our institution has commented on the value of using the term claim, for example, instead of thesis, when she heard students use it when she visited a first year comp classroom. Many writing proficiency faculty have said that they much prefer the term conventions than mechanics and grammar, because it conveys the idea that these are agreed on practices and help students understand that they emerge from a community and they're not written in stone on the 10 tablets. So this kind of lexicon. Structural affordances is another possibility, I think, particularly professional development activities. And this is something that I've been taking a lot more seriously since Donna and I have been working on this project together. So we have this annual 3-day summer writing retreat. It's themed backwards by design. We've had it for the last 10 years with faculty from across the disciplines. But in the last 2 years, I have made a deliberate effort to invite our first year comp TAs into that workshop. Now, given Donna's account of interactional expertise, I want to look for even more opportunities to bring that expertise into the conversation, both because they help promote a shared vocabulary, but also because they help advance some common conceptual frameworks about writing, about teaching and learning. When first-year grad TAs have been in the mix, the resulting dialogue has helped provide the outside-the-discipline bridging assistance that Fraser insists is necessary to facilitate transfer. That's the one time I've used it. Because outside of first-year comp. Particularly in creating an understanding of a genre analysis. So for example, at the workshop, and this has happened in the last couple of years, in the course of talking about how to create effective writing assignments, some of the first-year instructors often help the writing proficiency faculty understand genre conceptually. And as a result, they become less focused solely on genre as containers or forms to take. Last year, our workshop also brought in faculty who teach with service learning. These joint forums provide a venue for bringing in broad-based learning theories and concepts. Last year, I drew on threshold concepts as a place to begin for our backwards journey, not only because it provided a common terminology, but a shared conceptual framework. I guess my point here is that it's not then just about writing, it's about teaching and learning. Unfortunately, if you remember the administrative responses, these kinds of professional development sites do not bring in administrators, except if they come for lunch or something. So we need to look to other institutional initiatives that might provide more inclusive venues for expanding this dialogue to include them. Our pending Gen Ed revision initiative represents one such potential opportunity, since our process calls for the task force convening cross-disciplinary university subcommittees on topics such as writing and academic literacy. So that would be an opportunity, and you can be sure I'm going to make sure we have university administrators in that group. I think, is this going to go again? Okay. Okay, well, I'm just going to leave that slide up there, but I want to just say, in terms of the third thing, this expanded dialogue, that puts those of us who are studying writing more in dialogue with other scholars of teaching and learning, because it could enhance all of our interactional expertise enormously. Joel Fanghanel, I believe it is, and this is in a recent issue of Teaching and Learning Inquiry, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning new journal, suggests that the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is an exemplary form of professional development because it invokes not only a new paradigm, but a more sophisticated method, and one that represents a counter-model to the more traditional model of disciplinary scholarship that relies on competition. Instead, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning thrives on collaboration and co-inquiry, and I think it's much like the ethos that's been generated at our Elon research seminar. This is about building on each other's work. In this way, I think she's right that SOTL represents a democratic form of inquiry because it invites multiple voices, including students, into the dialogue. Further, it invites a dialogic mode of inquiry because it provides for multiple ways of going public, including conversation. So, given the affinities between our work and the work that the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning community is doing, I think things like this upcoming SOTL conference and reading each other's literature is really important. So, I would also like us to consider, what if we invited students in more as co-inquirers? Perhaps even especially undergraduates, if they were more directly engaged in our research on writing. The 6 students who helped me code greatly contributed to my study because they made me realize how slippery the terms we use for writing proficiency actually are. They also all reported being overwhelmed by the number of terms, the number of things that they have to do to be proficient academic writers. I think that's something that students remind us of. You know, there are just so many things. So the meta-awareness that comes out of our study is something we should make available to our students. This Teaching and Learning Academy, this campus-wide forum on our campus, gives students a chance to do that because it immerses them in talk about teaching and learning with faculty and staff and community members. And it's noteworthy that the way that we talk in this forum is often about the way we talk. Students help us to stop using teacher talk. I think that's one of the reasons why they're so important, both in designing our studies and in talking about them. Students gain too. They report gaining insight into their own writing and research processes when they get to play in this role of co-inquirers. In contexts such as these, undergraduates seem to be gaining the kind of interactive expertise from ongoing conversations with experts that Donna points to as being crucial for learning to write in multiple contexts. Perhaps these kinds of co-inquiry roles for students also represent what Etienne Wegner was suggesting when he said, it's good to invite them into our identities. In this case, our identities as scholars, as they compose their own identities as scholars. So what if we gave students more opportunities to be part of our conversations on teaching, learning, and writing, to engage them in the dialogue, because meta matters for all of us.